Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today at our Advanced Hoof Health Seminar. We're very excited to have everyone here today. I just want to take a second to thank both of our sponsors that we had for this program, which was Novus, and they're at the back here, and we'll hear from them a bit later, and then the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding for having Gerard out. And we're just super excited to talk about different methods, and we'll have a handful of speakers. I do have our schedule here that we'll be going through. So we'll kick it off with Dr. Cramer, then move to Carrie L. from Novus. We'll have a break for lunch, and then we will go back to Dr. Cramer, and then have another little 15-minute break, get up, stretch, and then we'll finish off with Tim Terry and final thoughts. And so the restrooms are down the hall. Most of you have found them already. And there are plenty of coffee and tea and fun snacks as well, so feel free to help yourselves. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce Dr. Gerard Cramer. He's a researcher with the University of Minnesota, and he flew out here to kind of have this talk, and we're super excited to have him, so thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to flip my topics.
Okay, that is all of it.
Perfect. Yeah, so as Katie said, I'm at the University of Minnesota, so prior to that, I worked in Ontario, Canada, had a kind of trimming practice. So I'm a veterinarian. I graduated from vet school a long time ago. Ran a dairy farm, ran vet practice, then the trimming business basically, and then about 12 years ago I started at the University of Minnesota. Been there ever since. I teach veterinary students, do research, and then things like this. Just so everybody knows, this is my conflict of interest statement. So as you can see, there's a lot of people on there. My philosophy is I try to make everybody a little bit mad at me. That means I'm kind of doing my job. But especially the research farms, trimmers, and veterinarians, I couldn't do some of the stuff that we're going to talk about without them. And then all the other people are signs that are on there. I've either given me money for research, I've spoken to them for money and that type of thing. So everybody's aware of my conflict of interest. Kind of what I do, make sure I'm staying on camera. Kind of what drives me is I want to influence change related to lameness in the industry. I'm trying to tell you that to kind of see what the lens that I come through. I like to be evidence-based, so I want to look for evidence if it exists. If it doesn't exist, I want to create evidence for things that we're doing when it relates to lameness. So today, what I want to talk about is kind of some lameness bottlenecks, some technology, and how we evaluate technology. I'm working with some technologies related to lameness detection. I'm just kind of going to get into some of the work we were doing and some of the work we're trying to do going forward. But just kind of give you a sense of what's out there, because it's probably one of the new frontiers. People kind of explain it. The way where lameness technology is right now is where heat collars and rumination collars were 20 years ago. Right? So we're just trying to figure out how to use them. They're new on the market. So how do we actually do some of this stuff? Since it's a small room, I would probably skip the polling stuff. For a bigger room, I just do polling. But if you I have some questions that I want you to, if you're comfortable, we can do it in person. Otherwise, we can use the polling software. But that's just to get some interaction from the audience. So I don't mind being interrupted. So if you think I'm full of it, I'm Dutch, so I can take it. So just let me know. I want the interaction, right? Because the meeting's ultimately for you. So if you got questions or like, hey, this doesn't make sense, we can talk about it and go from there. Okay, so we'll skip that because it's a smaller room. So when I want you to think about keeping cows mobile monarchs, like you probably got a lot of people on your dairies or people you talk to that says, okay, you got to do this, you got to do that, and that's going to fix your lameness issues that you have or reducing the lame cows you have. But what I want you to think about is if we have, let's say a 4-cow herd, and we're trying to keep 4 healthy cows, let's say for their life or the lactation, right? And people talked about trimming, hygiene, and foot bathing as being bottlenecks or things we need to think about when it comes to lameness, right? On this particular dairy, and what the consultant's role is to figure out, okay, which one of these bottlenecks is the biggest, right? Because I can fix trimming on this dairy, for example, we can change the method or whatever, but on this dairy, that's just has a small impact of lameness. If I fix this, I'm still going to have only 1 healthy lame cow because the biggest bottleneck is your foot bath scenario, right? So I want you to think about when people tell you do this or do that, feed this additive, implement this program, is that really the biggest bottleneck on your dairy? Okay, so that's one thing about, just around the room, what do you think is the biggest bottleneck on having less lameness on your neighbor's farm? Don't worry about your own farm, but on your neighbor's farm. What's the biggest thing that's holding them back from having less lameness? What do you guys think?
Our neighbors,
Sure, your neighbors.
arrogance,
Arrogance? Okay. So people,
people.
any other ideas?
Lameness detection is something that I see on a lot of people's farms. Can be
Okay.
difficult.
Can be difficult, so detection? Anything else? Okay. I think you had me on the podcast, we probably talked about it, right? So yeah, lameness, so if I think about it, to me the biggest barrier to having less lameness on your dairy, and probably the cheapest, in quotation marks, is detection. So finding lame cows, if we find a way to, so it sounds counterintuitive, and we'll kind of walk through why that is, but if we find more lame cows, you're gonna end up with less lame cows on your dairy overall. The reason for that is if we kind of walk through an 8-cow herd, just as an example, right? And they're seasonally calved, so this is a made-up scenario, but it illustrates the point. What I'm trying to show is if this is the duration of lameness, that's the length of the blue bars here, right? So here we have a cow, for example, cow 5, she was lame right when she freshened, and then eventually she got treated and she stopped being lame roughly about just under 100 days in milk, okay? So if your assessor or your farm program or whatever, your auditor comes at, let's say, 140 days in milk and counts how many lame cows you have today, right? So most of your programs have some sort of standard that says you could have this many lame cows. This is what your prevalence is. So if we score this herd, this 8-cow herd, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 lame cows in this herd. So they have a 50% prevalence on this dairy. Now if the only change they made is to say, we're gonna find these lame cows early. They're still gonna get lame, so we're not changing the number of new cases we're getting, we're just changing how we're finding them. So now we're gonna find them at the same time, they're still gonna be lame, but we're gonna find them earlier, and we're gonna treat them earlier, so they're gonna be lame for a shorter time period, right? Instead of waiting for somebody to magically see them, we're gonna be more intensive, let's say weekly or bi-weekly, we're gonna find them, we're gonna treat them right away, and we're gonna use the right treatment. What we're doing is we're reducing the time that each cow is lame. So if we look at that, that's the impact of this gray bar. So the dark gray is how long she's now lame, and the light gray is the time she's no longer lame, right? So we've reduced the duration of disease. So now when we do this on this 8-cow herd, the assessor comes on the same time period, this cow is no longer lame, this cow is no longer lame, this cow is no longer lame, and only this cow is lame. Right, so without changing anything other than finding and treating lame cows earlier, we've reduced our lameness prevalence on your audit, on your criteria that you get judged on, taking it from 50% to 12.5%. Right, and we still have the same number of lame cows and everything else. Right, so that's the theory behind detection and why it's the biggest thing you can do to impact it. And we'll get a little bit more into how to do that. But that, if you're gonna take one thing home from today, I would say if you can figure out how to get better at lame cow detection, I'm going to show you some more data to back some of that up. But the problem with lameness is we have too many chronic cows. If you remove the chronic cows from the population, we actually don't generate that many new cases. It's the cases, the cows that come back on us that create some of this problem. And part of that is because we're not finding them early enough. So they have more inflammation, they get more bone growth, they stay chronic, and then they just come back every lactation. Right, unless you look at their records to identify that, you're probably not going to realize that. But if you start separating your data out, saying, okay, these are new cases and chronic cases, some of these older cows, they're basically, all of them are getting lame, but they've all had a history too. So it looks like she's okay, this cow is lame, she's a new case, but if we go back and look at her history, she's probably been lame once or twice already in her life. Okay, so there's different ways. We talked about finding lame cows, right? So there's different systems. They all kind of take all these behaviors in once and kind of give the cow a score or whatever. It doesn't really matter. I would argue if they display some of these signs, so typically 2 of these signs I would say, okay, this cow needs to be looked at. There's obviously the 3-legged lame ones, but I would argue for finding 3-legged lame cows, those are cows that are too late. You need to find them before that, because when they're 3-legged lame, they've already been suffering, because cows are kind of prey animals, right? In their life, they get eaten. They don't eat other things. So they hide behaviors, they hide pain. So when they're showing pain, they're basically saying, hey, come eat me. So that takes a long time before they start doing that. So we have to be more subtle and be better at finding lame cows before they get to this really good lame cows. Okay, so how do we do that? So typically we can either watch cows, we can score them in stances. None of these systems are perfect. We can do parlor detection. It's amazing actually how much you can see just quickly like walk through the parlor and say, okay, this cow here has a crack right here. She's kind of imbalanced. Her block's not doing what it's supposed to in this scenario. So you can do this relatively fast. With some training, we can start picking out cows relatively fast, as long as there's a system, right? So the biggest thing I get is we need to have a system to do this. So I would argue whatever we do, but there has to be a system, and I would argue it has to be somebody's job. It can't be everybody's job, because if it's everybody's job, when I was going through vet school, it was everybody's job to find cows and heat, right? And now it's, okay, we have a program, or it's the caller's job, or we do a sync program, right? So we've dedicated somebody to say, okay, it's your job to find lame cows. That's what I think. And depending on herd size, I would argue most herds here, probably you're looking at once a week, somebody should be looking at these cows or something, right? Treat the severe ones immediately, kind of we were talking about before with emergency trims. The mild cows, it gets a little trickier because but you just need to have a system to identify. Okay, so we're gonna talk a little bit about this. The other bottleneck I think we have is that we don't necessarily always talk the same language. So I got two lesions here. Which one of these is an abscess? This one here or this one here? Obviously I have my remote going, but which one would you classify if you're writing stuff down as an abscess?
One on the right.
This one here?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, which is right. This is the white. So what I would argue, if we're recording things appropriately, I don't want to see the word abscess anywhere. Because this is, you're right, this is an abscess, but what if this little pus pocket is gone? Is it still an abscess? So I would argue this is really a white line and this is a sole ulcer, right? And you can have abscess, you can have pus coming out of this lesion. And if we start saying abscess, what some people will do, okay, well, if this is pus coming out of it, now it's an abscess. And it's still an ulcer, right? The original cause is still an ulcer. So the way we record things, I think, is important. I would argue if we get talking about lesions, and I think I have them coming up here, right? There's really major lesions and there's minor lesions. And if we record these, we have one more, but major lesions here. So if we have digital dermatitis here, sole ulcers, white line disease, and thin soles here, those are the main lesions. If we record those 4 lesions plus foot rot accurately, we're gonna be able to work with most data on most areas and to make decisions based on what's happening. Okay? Then if we think about the minor lesions, we have corkscrews, maybe not minor in some herds. We have these hemorrhages or sole ulcers, I would argue. Think of hemorrhages or bruising as kind of the early indicator of sole ulcers. And then we have foot rot. Okay? So if we ever, these lesions, so foot rot we need to record because we're usually typically using antibiotics, but if we record those 5 lesions, I would argue you can, whatever other minor things that we can see, it's probably not as big a deal. If we record these lesions, we're gonna be good, right? And I simplify it even more sometimes. So if we go back to this one, I call anything that's in the toe here. So for example, a thin sole, or some people call it a toe ulcer. A toe ulcer is just a thin sole that didn't get caught early enough, right? So there, to me, anything that's happening in there, even though it could happen on the white line, or it could happen, you could have a little ulceration here, just call it in the toe, because all the risk factors that cause these lesions are all different, right? So if I think digital dermatitis, we think hygiene and foot bathing. Sole ulcers, I think standing time. White line disease, I think what's happening in your holding area or flooring. Thin soles, I'm thinking either over wear from new concrete or the grains of sand, or over trimming. So these are all different risk factors that I want to look at. So if we separate them and remove the word abscess from the vocabulary, it reduces the chance of making mistakes. Because this is truly an abscess, but we can get abscesses happening here. And a lot of times when I talk to farms, they're like, okay, well, anything that has liquid coming out, I call an abscess. Well, then I lose the ability to differentiate to say, is it a sole ulcer, so standing time, transitions kind of stuff, or white line, walking distance, flooring type things. Okay? that's just my little preaching happening there. So let's get back to technology, right? So if we can identify lame cows, record things properly, how can we use technology to do that, right? So the current technologies that have been evaluated, we're looking at cameras, whether 2D or 3D, and then collars have been tried to be evaluated to use for finding lame cows, right? And if you ask the companies, their process is we have a technology, put it on the cow, identify something with the cow or the behavior, and then they give you a score. Okay, what I would argue should happen is we have the technology, but it should result in something actionable that you can change and influence, right? So just because the cow is a score, I need to be able to know, and I would argue what you need to know in the dairy is if I put this cow in the chute, is she gonna get better or not? Is she gonna make more milk? Is she gonna have less lameness? Blah, 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 instead of just saying what's her score. Okay, so some of the sensor technologies, of course you're probably familiar with them, ear tags or collars. If we evaluate how they've been used for lameness, so this is using a specific type of collar, that's the moo monitor collar. It doesn't really matter, there's other studies that have been done, but this is kind of the study that's been done most recently, and basically what it's saying, okay, if you use the sensor data points, and I'll show you what those were, they use rumination, eating, resting activity, and they divide it up in low, medium, and high. If you take all those values and put them all together and say, does it predict lameness, yes or no? Basically, if it's no good, or if it's like flipping a coin, it's this line. So this one is a little bit better than flipping a coin. You want to be as close to this point here, because the sensitivity and specificity, we'll get into those terms a little bit later. But you want it, if the technology works really well, your graph should be up in here. Okay, so this technology on its own is basically no good. And then the biggest thing that it impacts is low activity, which makes sense. If we could find some cows, if they're not active, then it's fine. If we add lactation and days in milk, see how it moves closer to this top left corner? It starts to help a little bit, right? But then actually the age of the cow is the most important thing, which gets back into the chronic thing that we were talking about before. If we add sensor data plus lactation and days in milk, that is more helpful, it gets better too. But then age is still the biggest thing that's influencing. And then if you add milk and milk weights, it makes it a little better. But to me, the take home from this is we have the sensor technology, but it's not the greatest. With these values, you're going to get a lot of false positives to deal with. Okay, so people aren't necessarily using sensor technology at this point. People are trying and looking at it, but anytime they do it, it's kind of like a mixed bag results. Okay. So then let's talk a little bit about vision technologies, right? So there's typically, as far as I'm aware, these two, so Kanawha is a 2D camera, and then recently, basically since World Dairy Expo, there's a 2D or 3D camera that's on the market, marketed by NEDAP. Those are the two that are actively being marketed here in the US. This is another camera system. These are very similar, but another 3D camera. They're marketed in Europe. This company here is based out of South Dakota. There's some around, but I haven't seen them actively being marketed. So that's vision technology. So what does the vision technology do? This is an example from Kanawha, which is a 2D security camera mounted up high. But basically what it's doing, it's taking pictures like this, and then they were trained, so the camera's mounted over here, and they were trained on people scoring them like this. So what people do is they score these cows walking here, they have the camera images, and then with technology and artificial intelligence, they say, okay, is there any relationship between what the camera can detect based on the cow, and if you ask them, what is the camera actually looking at? It's kind of a black box, right? So it's likely looking at how the cow's moving, how it's swinging her head, how her hips are moving, that type of thing. Okay, so what it ends up is saying, okay, this cow are the same cows, that's her score. The first step in this technology is to get, okay, what is a cow, right? Because it's just seeing images and pixels. So it outlines the cow, so somebody sat there and drawn, okay, this is a cow. Then they said, okay, this is the score, and everything fed together gives the cow a score. So what you get with this technology is you get a score ranging from 0 to 100, with 100 being like severely lame, and their cut point is 50. Okay, so that's one way that people do it. The other camera that's out there is a NEDAP camera. That's actually a 3D camera. So we have the typical 2D version, or 2D version, but you can see with this one, it's a better quality camera. And then also has a 3D where it starts, we can get depth in it, right? So they can look at more detail of the cow, but that's kind of the two different cameras that are on the market. And their system they go from a healthy cow as a high score and a not healthy cow as a low score. Okay, so they're backwards. So sometimes you hear me stumble because I'm working with both technologies. But in their terms, a cow that has a low score is a lame cow. With the other technology, a cow with a high score is a lame cow. Okay, so the setup on both of them is roughly the same. They have a camera mounted. They need a distance for the cow to walk, which is typically about 9 to 12 feet. And then typically between 10 to 12 feet is where they mount the cameras. The cattle eye camera can work. They all work best in a single file. The cattle eye camera can handle a multiple return lane type setup. The NEAT camera at this point is just single file because they rely on a reader. So basically the NEAT camera has a reader right here, and I'll show a picture of that later, where it actually identifies the cow. The cattle eye camera learns cows, kind of like the same thing your phone recognizes your face through facial recognition. So the cattle eye camera works best with Holsteins because they have different markings and they can use that to identify the cow. It can handle some like Hojos or crossbreds, but if you have a herd of just Jerseys, it'll fail because they can't separate the cows or tell them apart from each other. Okay, so how does this technology work? Does it work well? So the initial stuff that came out about this theory, or about this technology, was done in Europe. So they had 3 herds, about 6,000 cows, and what they did is, okay, we compared one person to the technology and the different herds. And what they did is, okay, what's the lameness prevalence? So imagine you came in, or your auditor came in and said, what's your lameness prevalence on your dairy? So they did it at different time points, and then the black is the human, the gray is the cattle eye, and basically they're saying, okay, they're roughly the same when we look at it. There's some variation point to point. So we can do a reasonable job saying, okay, the lameness prevalence on your dairies is similar. But that's not something actionable that you can do anything with for the individual cow. Maybe at the herd level we can, but not at the cow level. Okay, so then they looked at, can we use the data together with some cow level data to get at saying, can we make some actionable items? So when they do that, they have different scores. So we have cows with severe lesions. So this is days prior to trimming. So trimming was here. This is basically a month back, and this is their score. Right? So high score in this system is worse. So the camera, and this is repeats out with other data that we have, it can separate out the cows that are severely lame. They start to be higher scores earlier, about, let's say, 23 days earlier, they start to separate from each other, compared to cows with mild or moderate lesions. And when they said severe, typically you're dealing with like white lines, soul ulcers, and actively painful DD lesions, not the minor DD lesions, right? So that's based on looking back, historical data, we can see that it can separate cows out from each other that are lame. But that is all historical data. Nobody's done the study yet where they said, okay, I have a score, I treat the cow, does she get better or not based on that treatment? Okay, so how do we do that, right? So does it work? We kind of look, remember your data, this is kind of the data that they said, okay, this product works, it's on the market. But that was did in Europe, smaller herds, so we try to answer it, does it work here in the US or North America, can we make it better? Okay, so now there's a question for you all, right? So if you send 100 cows to the chute based on some detection technology, say this technology saying these cows need attention, they're lame, how many should have a lesion? 0? Okay, other guesses. So if the camera says she's lame and she needs attention, how many should you think have, or would you think is reasonable to have a lesion? I think you probably meant 100 instead of 0. What do you all think?
I was answering a different question than you asked. In a perfect world, it should be 0. How many is the camera going to detect?
Okay, you're saying how many should the camera detect? I'm saying it's detected 100 and you send them to the chute. How many of those actually have a problem we can do something about? How many do you want to have a problem? 100. So you want 100% accuracy, basically. Okay, or 100%. What would you accept? Would you accept 50? Would you accept 25%?
What does the camera define as lameness, I guess?
Okay, that is a great question, right? That's why.
Because as you're moving down through it, I'm thinking, okay, if you have a cow with a little bit of a stifle issue or something, she's gonna pick up because she doesn't walk correctly, but it may not be a foot issue.
Right.
I mean, a cow could suck the lameness and she just needs a routine trim. I don't know.
Right. Okay, this is why we're having this discussion, because I think those are all valuable questions, right? So that's why I don't think the number should be 100, because there's gonna be cows exactly like you said. She walks different, she probably needs a trim, and then she walks better, and hopefully we've prevented her from becoming lame in the future, right? So that's why I think a number between 50 and 70 is probably like a reasonable standard, because they're, that's okay, no surprise. I walk a lot and throw things around. But yeah, the stifle cows, I would argue that's still identifying something, so we do something with her. Okay, right, so this is just something to consider and talk about. So let's say, like, probably not 100, but let's say a 50 is what we kind of say. Okay, so the first question, if it's not great, or not as well as we want it to be, one of the issues could be that it's because this is not necessarily relying on the ear tags, it's every cow, right? It's actually learning the cow. So it could be, does it identify the cows properly? So we actually tried to evaluate it. So what we did is we painted these numbers on the cows. And because on their website what you get is you can actually get a video of the cow. We can go in and see, okay, when I paint this cow with X6, and the cow, it says it's cow 60, I can go look and say, was that really cow 60? Because I have her marked, I've scanned her RFID tag, that type of thing. So when we do that with the cattle-like technology, basically, it can identify the cows with about, so it identified within 7 days 84% of the cows. So it needs more than 7 days to learn and recognize the cow. But when it does it, it identifies basically 98.9% of the cows accurately. So it's pretty good. It's, I would say, almost perfect at identifying the cows, but it takes a long time, I would say a long enough time to identify the cow. Right, so if you're relying on it to identify early fresh cow lameness, for example, this technology where it needs to learn the cow isn't necessarily going to be fast enough to do that.
Are you trying to identify the cow, or are you trying to build a baseline of what she does?
Great question.
Because if you identify the cow, you should be able to link whatever ear tag or collar she has to that to know which cow it is. But as those things are set up, it takes 7 days to figure out what her normal is. So how are you?
Both. So when you talk to them about it, how it actually learns the cow, so it's using some of the markings on her, but also some of her gait characteristics. So it's basically saying, let's say we have 10 unknown cows that are in your parlor, and it runs through the camera. On the first day, it just says, these are 10 unknown cows I'm going to rent, but I know from ID system, either from the sort gate or from the parlor, that these 10 cows walk through the parlor. So it's just randomly going to give them a number, because it doesn't know which one it is with this technology. And then the next time the cow comes through, there might be 5 of those same cows and 5 different ones, because your parlor looks different. And then it says, okay, well, I know now that these 5 cows look like this, and they're all together, so now I can be better at predicting it. So over time, it gets basically to that 99%, both the behaviors and everything else. The NEDAP camera, actually, I have a picture of it later. It just uses the sort gate RFID.
Well, the other part is, if it's just learn these cows, and she has a foot problem, does it recognize the foot problem right away, or does it say her gait is always like this? This is her norm.
It doesn't do the norm, so it recognizes. So what it's trained against is basically when they trained the data. So they basically had people score roughly 20,000 cows, and correlated that with the score. So when it gives a cow a score, it's not comparing it to herself. It's just comparing it to whatever it's been trained on to say.
So is that 7 days because that's based on the number of times the cow is passing under that camera?
Yes, right. So on this, and that's
So like milking times, like if you milk 3 times a day.
yeah. So that's so depending on the camera setup,
21.
21 times. But so let me show this one, right? So this is the NEDAP camera. It's using kind of the wand right here, so it knows the cow's walking underneath the camera, and there's the wand, so it has a timestamp, and it knows when these cows go through. So it's basically, we're evaluating it right now. The NEDAP camera doesn't have a lot of data behind it yet, but or published data behind it yet, but it should be close to 100% because it knows exactly which cows walk through it in this scenario. But then to get at your point, the catalyze system does everything in the cloud. So it records the video, sends the videos up to the cloud, and all the processing happens on AWS and Amazon. NEATApp's camera, all the processing happens on the dairy. So Catalyze, to reduce cost, only records one milking per day, whereas the NEATApp camera records all 3 milkings. So when you said how many times does it pass underneath the camera, it passes underneath the camera 3 times a day if it's milking 3x, but it only records her with the Catalyze camera once a day, whereas with the NEATApp camera, it records her every single time she walks under it. Right? Because it's the processing happening on farm or in the cloud, and there's different costs because you gotta have the bandwidth and the processing costs. So that's probably part of why it takes longer to learn the cow, because really we're only seeing her 7 times. And if there's, and it'll discount cows, for example, if we have the multiple alleys, if I can't identify the cow appropriately, or she's like moving her head, or there's 2 cows that are really close together and can't separate them, then it's gonna discard that information.
Would you make it more efficient by putting another camera on a longer alley?
Yes, but then if you're thinking about
Then that's gotta,
double the bandwidth and double the images, now that you're now processing everything else. Right, so actually so I'm working with both cameras at this point in time, and we're actually redoing the study where we measured the ID accuracy, because we're going longer than the 7 days to try and see, okay, how long does it actually take to actually learn some of these factors, and we're doing it last study was done on 2 sites too, and this one we're doing it on 2 sites too, and they're all relatively single files, but a wider would probably increase the time it takes to learn.
you know, like the timestamp of when she should be in there, it can pick from a smaller pool of identifying.
Yes, right, so we have time, for that one, we actually have the timestamps that we know she went through. Okay, but it's, so basically the bottom line is, again, I've been working with the NEATApp, I don't have the numbers yet, but I'm pretty confident it's gonna be close to 100%. Like, basically both of them is 100% once it knows the cow, okay? So what's the relationship to lesions, right? Because this one was, the other study that I showed was done with, in the UK, smaller herds. This is data when it first came out. Basically looking at, so we have different lactation groups. These were cows that were coded as having a trim. And this is time of trimming right here. So this is early, and then go back. So you can see it's relatively consistent for these cows. As lactations go up, the numbers, like the actual number, go up a little bit. So we start out with a number, the average or the median being 36 for first lactation cows, a little higher for second, but in 4th lactation we're looking at 43 and 44. Right, so that's going to indicate, and these bars here indicate how much of a spread it is, right? So the range, the middle number is 36, but the range is all the way from 25 to 75 for a healthy cow in this scenario. Then if we look at cows with a lesion, we can start to see the average score, or the median score is actually higher up to 4 weeks before in most lesions, right? But we can see the numbers differ, right? So here we have the median at the time, like the week before trimming, is 47 for a lesion cow compared to 36. But here we're at 51, and here we're at 52, right? So there is a difference, you can separate the groups, but the range, there's a lot of overlap between the scores, right? So if we're gonna rely, if you now have a score in front of you today, says this cow has a score of 50, she could be a healthy cow, or she could be a cow with a lesion. Okay? If we look at specific lesions, so this is digital dermatitis, the same graph. This is sole ulcers, so here you can see the scores, they don't change much. Sole ulcers go up, and actually digital dermatitis is very similar to no lesion cows. And then white line disease is a more sudden increase than we see, right? So it's separating cows, you can tell them earlier, that type of thing. And then if we correlate the actual score with locomotion losses, so this is the range of the score, so this is healthy cows. The system classify healthy cows as less than 50, and these are cows with problems. And what we're seeing is that as the scores go up, you're seeing more daily milk production levels. So that tells us the system is telling us something, and it correlates to lameness scores, and it has an impact on production with it. Okay, so that tells us, and this is what we're using some of that for genetic evaluations to say, But so the system's trained on locomotion scores. It seems to perform similar to using locomotion scores, because if we locomotion score cows, we're not very good at finding cows with PD, but we can find ulcers and white lines with it. Okay, but it still doesn't necessarily, I would argue, it still doesn't tell you if I have a cow with a score of X in front of me, what do I do with her? It doesn't have this action. So some people tried to do that. So this is kind of the data I showed before, but this is still historical. But they also came up with some thresholds, right? So they said one of the threshold is greater than 50. Other studies, they said, they use, okay, what about the monthly average? Well, the average, maximum average for the month, minimum average, and how many percentage above 50. So they had different cut points that they evaluated, basically all within a month. So that's what this study that I showed, these are some of the cut points that they evaluated to come up with. So what we did is, what about chronic cows, right? Because what happens with machine learning, anytime people do studies with machine learning, they train it on this original farm, right? So they train it here, and then what a lot of people do is they go back and test it back on the original farm. And that's like, it's not like inbreeding, but it's kind of like inbreeding, because you're evaluating on the training data. And when you've been trained on something, you're going to do better on that data set. So when you take it out of the training environment and evaluate it on a different data set, it's typically going to perform worse and not as good. But so this data was all generated in the UK, and then we're evaluating it, the studies that I was showing you before, it was being evaluated back in the UK. So similar conditions, some of the same farms that the data was trained on. So the performance is always going to be better with it. So what we said is, okay, you're ignoring chronic cows, and you're also doing it in the same environment, the same type of system that you're trained on. What does it look like when we do it in our scenarios? Okay, so what we did is we started a validation study. We did a small-scale validation study where what we did is we evaluated every cow, basically in 3 different time periods. We just took a little bit of horn off to see what's going on in the foot, and we recorded every single thing that was available on this foot, and we hoof tested every single hoof to say, okay, do you have a problem or not? Because we wanted to know what happens to cows that are healthy to start, and then we look at them again basically 4 months later. What do you have? Can we use that data to say, how does the system work? Okay, so we did different time points, basically early lactation, mid lactation, and then peak lactation, or like fresh, and then peak lactation. We did different cows and different cut points, 2 different sites. And then we classified them as lesions we can do something about. So we can treat digital dermatitis, we can treat ulcers, we can treat trough lesions, and we can treat white line disease. And then there's all these things here that we see on feet, and we don't know what to do with them, right? So she doesn't have anything. Sometimes we hoof test it, and then she's got a lesion. She's responsive to pain, and what does that mean? Hemorrhages, heel horn erosion, and corkscrews. Okay, so if we look at this data, right? So here we have overall different sites. So we didn't have a lot of lesions when we went back 4 months later to find it. So we had about 500 cows we looked at. We lost some cows with culling, so about 60 cows actually had something that had lesions. And now we're going to look at some definitions, so we're all talking the same language, right? So if we have what the technology is doing and what actually happens, right? So then we have treated and treated. So if we would have said both, the system says this is a cow you should treat, and we treated the cow, that would be a true positive. If the system says you should treat it, and we didn't think it was worth treating, then that's called a false positive, okay? Same thing, not treated, and we treated it, that's a false negative, and then not treated and true negative, that's basically a true negative, right? And then you can add all these things up, and you can start calling some things. So when people say accuracy, so when you read something, we want something that's X% accurate, it's saying, okay, how many were true positive, how many were true negative, divided by the total number, okay? When people say positive predictive value, which is the question I was asking before, if we send cows to the chute, how many actually have something? That's called positive predictive value, which is basically how many are truly positive divided by the total number that the system called positive, right? So when we're talking about 100%, that Aaron wanted, that means, okay, I send 100 to the chute, and 100 of them have to have something that would be the positive predictive value. Okay, so when you talked about it before, like I think we kind of said, okay, higher than 50, some people want 100. Okay, so when we look at that versus the data we had, so we had camera data on all these cows, and we had all the lesion information, and we said, okay, how good is the system? So if we look at accuracy for the different cut points, so this is percentage percentage lame, minimum, all these cut points. The most accurate one was using the 50. But then we look at the positive predictive value. We're looking at 25% for the 50, and then these are the different ones, but they're all basically around 25%. So the different colors here are, so the green ones are true negatives, so that's really the right number, and then the true positives are in here, right? So all in here. But on all these empty orange ones are all false positives. So the system's saying, go look at this cow, and there's nothing that we think is worth treating with, okay? So these systems, when we do them, the best one still has basically positive predictive value around 25%, right? So I send 100 cows to the chute, only 25 have something. So I'm trimming 75 cows that either have something else, we did identify stifle, that's what we got, or, like you said, they needed a trim, and do they get better? Right? We didn't have the data to say, do they get better? But to me, even then, like, to trim 75 cows, it's a lot of things we have to think that they're gonna get better with it or prevent something. Nobody's been willing to pay me to do that study yet. So that's kind of where we're at. And then we said, okay, can we make it better? Can we take some of this cow level data with her history? So does she have a lesion history, yes or no? What lactation is it, what stage in milk, that type of thing. Can we make it better? So we took the same data, also included body condition score. So this system can also do body condition score. This is just an output of what it looks like. And then we created our own model. And basically when we do that, so if we look at any outcome or what we said was treated, so if the any outcome includes if she had, let's say, a stifle or a hock injury, we're really not much better, right? We're in either 30% or 15%. And then if we compare it to the farm staff, so what we also had is data from the farm staff saying, do you have, they sent cows to the list. They identified this cow needs to be trimmed. What's their positive predictive value? So ours was around 30, theirs is around 70. Okay, so the farm staff is identifying cows. But if we look at which cows are being identified, so the farm staff is identified 19, the model identified 16 with problems, both of them identified 8 together, so they're identifying different population of cows. Right, so the farm staff is finding these cows, but it missed these 16. This model is identifying basically these 24, but it missed the 19 that the farm staff said had a problem. Right? So they're identifying different cows, probably reflecting earlier lesions. So the farm staff is finding severely lame cows. This is what probably finding some more earlier cases. But I would argue, ideally the model should identify these cows and the earlier cases that the farm staff is missing, right? So they're complementary, not necessarily replacing each other, right? Which makes it hard to pay for. Okay, then this is hot off the press. What we try to do is, okay, can we incorporate the collar data too with that information? So we have the camera data and we have the collar data. Does that make it any better? We're still working on this, but basically the driving factor on that is still the locomotion score. Eating time seems to be the next predictable information that's out there. But if we look at the data for that, so the accuracy is similar to what we had before, and then we could turn these two numbers into a positive predictive value. It kind of depends on how much lameness you have. So if you have a relatively low level number, you're looking at 25%. If you have more lameness, you're looking at over 50% if we incorporate some of the collar data with it. Okay? So what do we do with that, right? So we have, I think, I would argue where we're at right now, we have a toy. We have a toy, but we don't have a tool yet. We have something that we can potentially use, but we need to figure out how to use it, and we need more data to come with it, right? And we need to think about, what are we using it for? Are we using it for detection? Or are we using it to measure compliance to an audit or a farm program or a quality assurance program? Because those are different purposes, right? If you're trying to use it for compliance, saying, okay, what's my number? It can probably do that. If you're trying to use it to detect lame cows, it's not going to replace a person to do it at this point in time. Okay, we have some data to say that, and we're working on trying to see if we can use it for genetics. So think about what CDCB. That's part of the reason they're sponsoring this meeting, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the project we have. They want to be able to create a genetic evaluation for lameness, so we can say this bull is good or bad for lameness based on either locomotion score, like the score from the cameras, or from lesion data. And when we do that, we can find some heritability even with this wide range of scores, that there's differences between animals and bulls with these scores, right? So there's probably potential for use for genetics. But I would argue what's needed is some more unbiased evaluations on herds that weren't used to train the cameras. Because most of the data that's now being put out was used on done on farms that were used to generate the data. Okay? So I think hopefully I've given you some chance to think about, okay, when you have some of this technology, and some of the discussion we were having earlier, you guys said we need some data, so I think that's true. Ask them some questions, say, okay, well, this data that you're showing me, like, was it done on the same herds that the system was trained on? That type of thing. Have you done X, Y, Z? Okay? Just a little sales pitch. I'm involved in a project. This is part of the reason at CECB, the big money's coming from a Foundation for Food, Agriculture, and Research, which is USDA adjacent. It's not USDA, but it's adjacent. What we're trying to do is trying to come up with basically trying to hit these 4 objectives. We're trying to create a framework to combine the data from trimming data and lesion data. Right now we're using dairy comp. In the long term, we want to be able to take other data to put it into the National Cooperative Database to create a genetic index. And then also answer the question, can we use this technology for something other than genetics or quality assurance? Can we use it to make decisions on the farm for detection? Right, so we're looking for herds that are interested in participating. So if you're interested, if you scan this QR code, you can kind of get a sense of what's happening. But basically what we can offer is we can put this technology on your farm for free for 14 months. If you have ID, have a good place for it to walk. And then we would basically give you the technology for free if you're willing to share data with us and are willing to have us try, okay, we have these cut points, let's see if it actually makes a difference. Again, it's some of the questions that were brought up. If we bring her to the chute, does she get better, right? Or do we prevent lameness cases? So one of the things we want to do is, let's say we have 100 cows that the camera flags, we send 50 to the chute, and we let the other 50 just be, and then compare them after a couple of months to say, okay, what's the difference between these 2 different? We're also trying to create some tools, extension tools to say, okay, what things do you need to do a better job with lameness, more knowledge, more education, how do we train your staff, that type of thing. Okay, so if you're interested in that, reach out to me. But questions related to the technology stuff?
I could see that maybe one of the sticking points on that is having uniform, being able to correctly diagnose what we're looking at.
Yes.
You know, if somebody over here would call it white line, and somebody else calls it whatever, you know, but we're looking at the same hoof, and then all that data, and then you end up with GI equals GO. And
Yes. So
it sounds
part
like
of
it's
the
gotta be the training.
yeah. So part of the project is the training. So part of the reason I'm here, and part of the reason CDCB is sponsoring it. So I'm tying in some research visits. I've been on some dairies trying to say, okay, I want to make sure that when we talk to trimmers and they're recording, is this an ulcer or a white line, that it's consistent in that area. So that's why my system, when we went through those lesions, it's relatively simple, because I don't care if it's a bad ulcer or a good ulcer. I just want you to say it's an ulcer and move on, right? Same with the white line. That's why, okay, this is the white line, anything else is in the toe, that type of thing. That's a very good point. And that's part of the process where we train the people to do it. Because there are lots of data sources that are out there where trimmers are recording electronically, but we run into that issue where people like calling this an abscess or they call it something else. So it's a huge issue that we're trying to address and create some resources for and training materials for.
Sorry, question, independent of the technology, whether we're using traditional gate scoring or technology.
Yep.
I always wonder about intervention, early intervention, like
Yep.
detecting, like, so a deviation from gait is response to pain,
Yep,
but it may not have yet manifested in an actual
exactly.
lesion.
Yes.
So when those cows are on the table, I don't know, is there trimmers here? Yeah.
Yep.
Like, what do we do with them? Like, are we hoof testing, and letting them go, and then from that point, response to pain, no visible lesion, how quickly will it turn into something you actually see?
That's a great question, and I would argue that's a study that needs to be done. Because nobody knows the true answer to that question, right? Because I think the follow-up question is, if I do something with that cow that doesn't have an ulcer or white line yet, but is painful. So when we did the study where we looked at those 500 cows, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but more cows than I was expecting were painful with nothing there, right? And the reason they're painful, if you think There's a hoof capsule, and then there's a bone inside of it. So this is the hoof capsule, and this is the bone. There's a tissue inside of there, what we call the cord. The reason cows have deviations from gait is because that tissue there gets inflamed and swells up. And it's got nowhere to go because it's got a hard wall here, it's got a bone here, and it swells up, right? So imagine you taking a hammer, bumping your nail, that hurts. The reason it hurts because this inflammation can't go anywhere. So some of these cows that we're seeing that are painful with hoof testers, which I would argue every hoof trimmer should have with them, they have pain. What do we do with them? I put a block on. Say, okay, you're painful on the one side, not on the other side. I'm going to put a block on that. I can't see anything. I'm not going to go digging for something unless there's swelling that I see higher up in the coronary band. But if she's got painful and I'm going to put a block on it. But we don't know what that is, and that's this part of the study that we want to do with this. Is like we're going to run these cows through the chute because maybe all they need is a trim, right? Because now we're balancing them out again. We're removing some of the weight in certain spots, and that's enough to control the inflammation.
Right.
In other countries, to control that inflammation, they have access to anti-inflammatories. And when we give some of these cows with early detection, there's enough data to say if we have so the latest study that they did is they locomotion scored cows every 2 weeks. And any cow that was lame with locomotion scoring was put on the table, and then they had different groups. Some of them got NSAIDs and some of them did not get non-steroidals. The cows with non-steroidals did way better than the cows that didn't. So less culling, less repeat if we gave them the NSAIDs. So we're controlling that inflammation without putting them. So that's part of the thing. I think if we have this pain, we can't see anything, do something to reduce that pressure, reduce that inflammation.
Yeah, question for the trimmers, are you guys, I never knew that was a thing actually, are you guys using hoof testers? Like to detect the pain for that?
No.
No. I don't know how common that is, I've never heard of that actually. But,
It's a $14 tool, and it should.
Yeah.
I would argue obvious lesions you're not going to hoof test, right? But it's those edge cases where you're like, okay, this cow's lame. Somebody identified her as lame. I don't see anything
yeah.
because I don't. We'll talk a little bit about it later, but when I trim, I don't call myself a white maker where the whole foot is white. If there's something there, I don't take horn off just to see what's happening. That's where I use the hoof testers because some of that horn I want to stay on the foot because if I remove it, I'm going to set her up for overwear. Right, so that's where the hoof tester comes in. Instead of digging at a black spot, because not every black spot is a lesion, right, I use the hoof testers to guide me. Do I need to worry about that black spot? But yeah, hoof testers, I would argue every trimmer should have them in their kit. I train people.
We use one on the emergency cows, and I've seen, as we do it with Jose's using that, and, sometimes you see something that's just sore there, and then we go from there, but, we don't do it, I know he doesn't do it on all cows on the other side, but
Right.
when we bring them in extra,
Yep.
then
Yes. Right, and I think that's the perfect case, right? You have a cow that you identified as lame, you trim her, and you're like, I don't see anything.
when you don't see anything, what do you do now?
What do I do now, right? So that's sometimes the hoof tester there is useful, and I also use it for cows with thin soles, because you have cows with thin soles, like they're soft-ish, like is that enough? And then if you squeeze on it, she's going to react. Then I'll put a block on it to try and prevent that wear from happening. So I use it more to guide my treatment. I don't necessarily for this study we did every single cow. I wouldn't expect trimmers to do that, but I would do a cow that I know is lame. So my ideal system is, if I have and we're going to talk about that in the next one, we have a list of cows that are given to the trimmer. You're trimming these 100 cows. I want them to know, out of those 100 cows, these many are routines, and these 10 are identified as lame. Because I want them to say, okay, these cows were lame. If I don't see anything, we probably should do a little more investigation just because we know she was lame. That's it, lame. That's where the hoof testers come in.
This may not be a fair question, what percent of lesions can we prevent with routine trimming?
Can you hold that thought? I have that answer.
Okay, but it's a lot though, right? It's not
We'll get there.
yeah.
I have that answer. Well, I have a version of that answer. I have some data to answer that question.
Yeah,
Put it that way.
I have a quick question on the cost of Cataly and Medac. Is the cost justified for what it, has it gotten to the point where producers can afford to pay for it? With how much it saves them on the back end of identifying and treating cows and preventing?
At this point, I think they're charging too much for what it's doing. Okay? Part of what this project wants to do is we want to be able to answer that question, right? And to do that, we need some data that where we follow these, we trim half the cows, we don't trim the other half. and say, okay, this is the impact of treating them earlier, and you're gonna save X amount of dollars when you do that. Right now, just rough back of the envelope math, they're charging too much with the Catalyze system. The NEDAP data, I don't know because I haven't worked with it long enough, and they haven't put any data out. They all have internal data. My initial impressions are good, but I still haven't been able, like, we're talking about doing something more formal,
Okay.
but my initial impression right now with what is being charged for these systems is too high for what the return is. And part of that, like, it's gonna change because right now, for the last 3 or 4 years, there was one product on the market, and now there's 2 products on the market, right? And so there's gonna be changes in the marketing and everything else.
Might help bring price down when you get competition too.
Yes, right, so now there's competition in the market, that type of thing, so it's probably gonna come down, but with the current numbers that I know with how much, like, positive predictive value, I would argue with this, right now, it's not worth more than 25 to 30 cents that you should pay, and then you're breaking even-ish. Like, that's rough math, making a whole bunch of assumptions that if I was in a scientific paper, I'd say that's BS, but that's the best we have at this point in time. But they're charging more than that for most farmers. Somebody else?
Yeah, oh, I've noticed like the last few years, there seems to be like a really high percentage of straight-legged, post-legged back
Yes.
end natives. Like, how does that, like with the technology and your genetic part of it, is there a category for that? Like,
So yes and no. So what I do with those cows, like they have, like I just call it upper leg, right? So there's something else going on that I can't fix in the foot. The technology, what I start doing with those cows, I code them, right? So I don't want you to flag these cows over and over. I know she's got a leg issue. I just want to know if she gets really bad, right? Because some of those cows, they have that straight leg, they get thin soles, and they, at some point, they blow up. But yeah, why that happens, there's different theories about what happens. I think part of it is heifer raising and this, like the combination of heifer raising, competition, and the rate of growth all kind of put together. Are you seeing a lot of corkscrews too with some of these animals, or not too much yet?
not too much yet. Just
Okay.
It just seems like in general, wherever I go, it just seems like there's a lot more. You know, that percentage is way higher than it ever was
Yes. Yep. And there's some, like there's obviously a genetic component to it. I think to answer that specific question, we probably need a different set of tools to figure that out. But yeah, it's definitely something that, but it's very herd specific.
At Marquardt's, it was because of the robots, they went posty-legged to be more robot friendly. And so it was a genetic choice.
Yes. And some of like,
We can go way too deep.
Yeah, some of them went way too far.
yes. Right, and that's, so there's a genetic component to it, but some, like, what we're seeing in some herds, like, I would argue, in general, the genetics from Holstein herd to Holstein herd is relatively similar, right? There's differences in, like, genetic potential, but the genetic pool is relatively similar. Why do some herds have a lot more of it compared to other herds? Like, yes, in general, we're seeing more of it, but some herds, like, I deal with some herds that have, like, 60-70% of these cows coming with corkscrews, and of those, probably half of those have these, like, posted legs that we're calling animals earlier. Why does that herd have that many, and another herd with similar genetics, like similar breeding company, not have that same issue?
It's a philosophy, because there's certain bulls, if they're pushing for the high butter fats or something, there's a bull that'll do that, and he's got a whole bunch of sons out there, and he makes them super straight legged. And if you stick to that path, and that's what they're driving for, because that's what they're getting paid for the nut price,
Then it's,
they're going for that all the time, and they're not looking at anything else. So, when I do it, I can't stick with one bull stud, because there's too much inbreeding. They're
Right.
locked into their stuff.
Yeah.
You have to go out and find other bulls that do the same things, that are different, you don't have as much inbreeding, and you won't have so much straight legs. If you stick with one herd, man, you just have straight legs like you would.
yeah, and some of them are like as heifers, they can't even
Oh, yeah.
survive in the heifer.
Yeah,
Heifer back.
we got into that too, and then we had to move away from that, but I mean, it's now something I have to really watch, because we're not trying to get those super posted legs. Some of the Holstein stuff comes through, because they're the ones who do the genetic evaluations, and then that's what both studs are using. They started to put that in, and now both studs are watching what the legs are, so that's helping.
Yes.
If you're looking for a certain trait, there's driving your milk shack. Sometimes you're only sticking to these certain bulls or their sons, and that's giving you the boost right there.
Right, and that's like part of what, like they're trying to create, like, because we have like these health traits, right? So we're just trying to add lameness as another
Yes.
health trait to it. That's part of the objective. Like that's the major driver of this project. I think genetics has a role to play in lameness, and that's an area probably a bigger role. But in other areas, it doesn't have a huge role to play. But there's other questions we can answer with piggybacking on that. Because I would argue, genetics isn't the answer to your lameness issue in the dairy industry. It's going to help, and it's permanent. But there's other things we can do that can result in